Hi everyone, and a warm welcome to tomorrow's Tech Today, bringing you the latest in technology, talent, transformational change, and of course tech as a force for good. I'm your host, Professor Sally Eaves, and today we're highlighting all things digital transformation in the financial services industry, and of course implications for other verticals too. And our focus is not just on emergent technology itself, but the vital people, process, culture, change management, and skills components too. And it also includes implications for scaling tech for good, such as AI and ML being used to predict affordability and provide early intervention support to help those at risk of financial exclusion. Fantastic to see this trajectory. So let's explore exactly this. And to do so, I'm delighted to be joined now by Brian Hayes, Senior Director for the Financial Services Vertical at VMware. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to the show, Brian. Fantastic to have you here.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me along.
Oh, absolutely. Always a pleasure. And I always like to start these things off with kind of getting to know a bit more, as I call it, the person behind the tech. I wonder, Brian, if you could just share a little bit more about yourself, your role at VMware with the audience, and maybe like a moment that mattered along the way too. Because again, as I've spoken about before, to a lot around inclusion. So I think sharing some of those moments that matter, as I put it, can really make a difference to people too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brian Hayes, I'm the Senior Director for Financial Services Industry Solutions at VMware, which means I get to spend my time across three key areas. One, really looking at the market, looking at the trends and creating thought leadership with not just myself, but the team I lead. The second piece is around working with our partners, our GSIs, our ISVs to create specific solutions that really matter to our customers, i.e. creating business outcomes. And then the third piece is, as you would expect, is spending lots of time talking to and listening to our customers across the breadth of the globe, and representing VMware in the executive briefing centres and those type of things. So that's my role at VMware. I've been here for, I guess, close to 3.5 years. I joined originally to lead as the industry director for financial services in EMEA. That was about 6 weeks before lockdown. So, an interesting time to join any organisation. Prior to joining VMware, I'd spent really the bulk of my career in financial services, and that would make sense. Working for predominantly, large retail, banking. So that's Morgan Stanley, Barclays, HSBC, etc. And that gave me the opportunity to live and work around the world. I've lived in Japan, I've lived in the US twice, I've done long spells in different locations. So that's how I'm here. Now, you asked about, is there a moment that was significant in terms of a moment of meaning? I guess there are a couple. The one that really is the earliest one that comes to mind was I was working for a bank, and they basically gave me the job of relocating a trading room in Tokyo, which in itself doesn't sound too, maybe it sounds exciting. If I tell you I was about 29, and they literally just said, Brian, go to Tokyo, come back when the trading room's moved, and all the people in it, and all the technology. Not being able to obviously speak Japanese, didn't understand, kanji or katakana and all of those wonderful things. And I'd never worked outside of the UK before. That, I think, was a defining moment in my career because of what I was able to learn about myself in that process.
I love that. And I think because I talk about skills development a lot, but also skills confidence. And I think going into a situation like that, where you're in a different kind of cultural context as well. I've done some work over in Japan myself, and I found it fascinating with some of the Kaizen techniques, continuous innovation, etc. as well, and some of the change management approaches too. But in so many areas, kind of being that hands-on and given that responsibility and what that does for confidence and accountability, I think is amazing. So what a fantastic story. I love that. Fantastic. And kind of drilling in more into the financial services sector specifically, and love the breadth of experience you brought to the fore there already. And you mentioned COVID. Obviously, there's so many different vectors of change has happened. COVID obviously being one of them, but obviously financial services perhaps a little bit ahead than many other verticals in terms of digital transformation in some areas. But what have you seen outside of that in terms of this convergence, certainly that I'm seeing at the moment, of different vectors of change? Obviously, we've got geopolitical ones, we've got the convergence of different technologies, but above all of these things, I think there's this changing expectations and behaviours we're seeing from consumers, but not just that, from from employees and different partners across our ecosystems too. I'd love to see what you've seen from your take on that and what's come to the fore as maybe most significant and impactful.
I think what COVID taught us through the scaling through COVID, because obviously no one could go anywhere, so everyone swung to a digital channel. Anywhere you look around the world, there are statistics that show that people were downloading their banking app for the first time, and that was in the region of 200,000 plus a day, depending on where you were. There is no doubt that the power that the customer holds and the necessity to deliver a highly consistent, secure capability is still key. Is absolutely key. We learned in the financial services industry probably about 15 years ago, when the trust was really questioned because of various different events that were going on around the world, and how the FinTech then overtook in the delivery of those capabilities in a very digital only manner. That was a body blow to a lot of the established organisations, who many have caught up, but the customer and the need to satisfy the customer in the most consistent way, in a secure way, that's the way to build that trust in reality. Now, you've also mentioned employees, and that's a swinging pendulum depending where you want to start from. Obviously, again, we saw a lot of people working from home, apart from those that were absolutely necessary to be office-based or in data centres or stuff like that. We're now seeing people operate they're sort of in that experimental mode of, do I need to be in the office 2 days a week? Do I need to be in the office 3 days a week? Is the organisation saying, actually, look, it's fundamental to our culture that people come back to the office, that we operate as a team, and that we create that capability? Some organisations that I can't name have tried various different things, and they've lost staff as a result, and staff have cited the fact that they don't want to come back into the office 5 days a week, so they've changed the policy to retain people, because we all know that attracting people and retaining people is a really, really difficult thing to do at the moment. So that, I think we're still in the experimentation stage of that. What you can see, we were talking before, being in London, a lot of the very large buildings are starting to sublet space. That's all in the press. So these things are definitely going on, and we're not at the end of it yet. And of course, the one thing that's also important, but now for very different reasons, is the shareholders. And the role that the shareholders play in helping orchestrate some of these transformational and change type initiatives that we have been seeing for some time. But now the change is swinging more to absolutely that diversity, inclusion, sustainability, the impact of social media, and how that's reacted to and how that's worked with for these organisations is going to constantly change. It's not going to stop.
Definitely. I mean, that agility, I think we need to look at it at 3 different levels now, because I think, again, the press typically picks up on organizational agility, etc. But we have to look at it from that team perspective, the individual's perspective as well, which will come onto a skills piece I'd love to come back to a bit later. But I love the fact that kind of the drivers of innovation in this sector and beyond is coming from a more holistic range of places, if you see what I mean. It's not just from within, it is the more conscious consumer. And again, with COVID, I think awareness around data literacy has improved. Kind of these different messages, whether driven by the curve or by the data, etc., was really affecting everybody's everyday life. And so that consciousness about kind of questioning that, what does that really mean, has given better transparency, but also more accountability now. So with ESG in particular, you're right, it's front of mind for so many people, which is fantastic to see. But what I'm loving now is there's more questioning about it. And rather than kind of just the once a year report, we get a better, more regular benchmarking and kind of moving on that way to be a bit more consistent and comparable, because that's the big gap, isn't it, when it comes to ESG? How do you compare one against another? It's tricky if not everybody's measuring the same thing. So that's an area I've got a big interest in, and I'm working on as we speak.
Yeah, you mean that it's not acceptable anymore just to tick a box? I think that's what you just said.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. No greenwashing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant stuff. So yeah, I love that. So we've got all these different change vectors coming together, new, say, drivers and catalysts of this innovation as well. And one of them I mentioned kind of a lead up to there was about technologies coming together. So whether that's AI or ML being used in new ways, not just for business benefits, but also for some societal ones as well. But got all these different things coming together. Where would you see this tech convergence in particular is making the most difference? So that could be kind of new business and growth opportunities, could be reducing fraud. But what are you seeing kind of as the biggest leaders of change in this particular area?
So from a technology perspective, I think you can't have a conversation or open a newspaper at the moment, if you still remember what one of those looks like, without bumping into a conversation around AI and ML and the potential impact it has on everyone. Because it's all upside at the moment. It's all, this is great, this will do this for you, this will create this capability, society will be a much better place. But there's lots of sort of similar things in history where it's not necessarily turned out that way. So there's a dynamic of, are we running too fast, or are we too slow to apply controls? And for me, when I look at technology, there isn't a singular technology that is the silver bullet. And the analogy I would use is, a pile of bricks is not a house until you apply other things to it. By design, you add cement, you get a wall. You add timber, you get walls. You add a roof, you get a house. Only then is it realised and fulfilled its potential. And I think we're at a point where there are a number of really almost astoundingly capable technologies that if we're able to bring them together with. So if you take AI and apply that to quantum computing, if you then put edge into the mix, and by AI I mean real AI, not ML that runs alongside it. But so if you take edge and quantum computing, if you take the Internet of Things and you say, right, actually now I'm producing 100 times more data every day than I was producing last year. How am I using that data? Whose data is that? So there are lots of ramifications. The use cases, well, yeah, they can all plug into anti-money laundering and know your customer and fraud detection. But I think where it will really, really kick in is actually how does that digital equality that we'll now have in society, and how is that going to help people with their financial welfare in a way that we haven't been able to do that before? So arguably, you're tooling the people that are in most need of it in a way that financial awareness. When I went to school, no one ever talked to me about mortgages or loans or the way that the monetary system worked or what I would expect when I grew up. It may sound like I've never grown up, but I think that's where the society and the impacts are going to start to be felt.
I couldn't agree more. I've done some work with the likes of like LexisNexis and organisations like that. They do some great work around financial inclusion and exclusion, from both perspectives, if you see what I mean. And that's what I've been particularly impressed with, the fact that the better we get at this, the more we talk about active intelligence in organisations, but what can we do about early intervention? So that's what I see. In the same way that we were talking about reflecting on what's gone well and what hasn't, what we can learn from COVID, the use of space. We're banking more community centres, bringing people in, entrepreneurship, etc. Same thing with data here. Make it an early intervention opportunity before someone gets to the point where they're defaulting even on a loan or something like that. If you can see that behaviour earlier, you can make a difference and really step in. And that, for trust, what a great kind of intervention that would be to build that. You have consumers for life if you can really support in that kind of way.
Well, if you think about it, if you go back 25 years, or perhaps when my parents, a bank was a place that you went to, right? And you did your banking business in a bank because there was no other way of doing it. So whether that was a loan application and a mortgage application, or you wanted to open a bank account, you physically had to go, and you met the bank manager, and the bank manager was held in high regard in society. Now I've got 65 different bank managers on an iPhone. So it's changed dramatically.
It has, absolutely. Alongside this, again, I always, when I do conversations like this, I like to look at it from kind of these multiple angles. So we've covered a bit about technology so far, but as we all know, any kind of digital transformation project, whether it's financial services or any vector, frankly, it's always this combination, isn't it? You have to look at things holistically. So it's this combination of the culture piece, change management, the right other kind of processes to support things too, and skills uplift, etc. It's all these different areas coming together. Culture of innovation. I've heard you talk about this beforehand, so that's why I kind of picked this as an area to go down. I really enjoyed a show you did quite recently where you kind of switched the mic. I like that quite a lot. I'd love if you could share a bit more about this, because it's like if you had an ingredient list, if you see what I mean. It's that one in the middle. It's that hub that keeps everything else together and brings everyone with you and shows you're doing that active listening you mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation too. So what does culture of innovation mean to you, from VMware, but also what you're seeing with your customers, and I think helping to facilitate that too? Because I've been in quite a few project conversations where I've seen quite really positive feedback about what you've done to support that too. So from all those angles, culture and innovation, what does that mean to you?
Okay. I can pack a lot into this.
Fantastic.
So I'll try and make it as succinct as possible. The culture of innovation is such a paradox for where we used to be in banking, because in banking you couldn't make mistakes, you couldn't fail, because that impacted you personally from a career perspective or from a compensation perspective, or you couldn't. We didn't run R&D. The mentality was, well, we don't run R&D. We buy something that's proven from a vendor or a solution provider, and we plug that in and make it work with other things. And over the past 15 years, what we now experience is that there is a complete different approach. Applications are king, because we all live by them on our mobile devices predominantly, and to really succeed in that space, the established organisations needed to become FinTech. Right? They needed to think in a way and operate in a way that other organisations were performing in, but they just happened to be in banking. Right? If you look at some of the apps that are out there, they could be doing any number of different industries, but they just happened to choose banking because banking was struggling at that particular time, and it was a great space to move into. And they decompiled the banking experience into many different things. So how do you create that culture of innovation? Well, how do you create a culture where innovation and failure is accepted? Right? In an established industry where failure was not accepted, it's like me saying, would you like to fly on an airplane? We're trialing out a few things today. We're not sure if it's going to work, but bear with us. We're probably not going to want to do that, and therefore. And there's 100,000 books written on cultural change and the complexities and difficulties of doing that. But what you are seeing, and is now people talk about digital transformation, is how do I digitize my business? How do I create digital capabilities that my customers want? But that's a way of life now. It's not, I've done all my digital transformation, I'm now going to move on to the next thing. That's not going to happen. So organizations where they've moved from this sort of quite lethargic way of working, very slow, very large scale change, are now moving to a very different environment and a very different culture. So, I think it was John Cotter, and I won't be able to quote him particularly well because I'm never really good. But Cotter basically said, change is not an event, it's not a transaction, it's something that you continuously pass through. It's really, really difficult, and it takes an inordinate amount of time. And it takes an incredibly strong level of leadership, top down, to sustain that commitment to do. Because there's lots of examples where people, it's like saying, well, the event is we're going to run 400 meters hurdles. You're about to get into the last 100 meters, and someone says, actually, it's a steeplechase. Pardon? No, you've got to carry on for another half mile. And then they say, well, actually, it's a marathon. So you've tuned yourself, you've engineered yourself to deal with a particular thing, a particular thought, a particular type of activity, and now you're having to change on the fly. And that's what's happening in these organizations. So they're creating a muscle capability to run change constantly in a complex environment, which is, the old world meets the new world. So how are they doing that is very well documented. That's about values and beliefs and getting people behind it and building an organization that develops muscle strength so that they can go again, so they don't stop. right? Because I think there's this, you don't run a transformation program and go, oh, I've stopped today. That's not going to happen.
Exactly. I totally agree. It's a bit like with security conversations, isn't it? There's quite often talk about like zero trust as one example, as if you can kind of go and buy something and like, oh, we've loaded that and it's done, everything's sorted now, I'm secure forever kind of thing. It's a really nice analogy because none of these things are ever like that. It's a continuous investment, isn't it? And commitment and learning along the way and frankly unlearning things along the way as well and being open to that. And that's why I always talk about skills so much, because again, with the skills piece, it's not just about making skills training available and also making it personalized, I would say, as well, but helping people then have the confidence and opportunities to apply those as well. Because otherwise you get another gap there, which could be a confidence one or just an opportunity to apply it one, a combination of the two. I think that sometimes gets left behind in these types of always on commitment, so to speak.
I use a phrase quite consistently. It's about confidence and competence, yes. Right? What you don't want is the most confident, incompetent brain surgeon. I'm really confident. I'll do that. I've never done it before, but isn't it just like whipping it off? Taking the top of someone's head, right? But I'm really confident. Equally, you don't want the most competent but not confident person. So how do you bring those things together? And then, if you talk about this in a broader management perspective, how do we bring those things together and then talk about the ability to communicate? And in communication, listen as part of that process, so that you can then extol those virtues upon other people. So for me, it's I totally agree.
Really, really interesting. And for me, you mentioned about marathons and things like that. That set off something else in my brain there as well, because gym and that kind of thing, not really my cup of tea. But what I really found quite interesting researching was gym for your brain, as I call it. So the metaphor of that was going off in my head as you were talking. And what I've seen really done well in organizations lately is where you've got this gain more personalized training that's going into things like, learning styles. And I say metacognition and helping people understand how they learn that works for them. Because there isn't just one right way. We all do things in different ways, don't we? But I think sometimes training, and then obviously going back before that to universities and schools, tend to have certain pathways and not kind of the multiple ones that reflect all different. Neurodiversity is one example of that. So again, I think that's another interesting area. Maybe we can do more around to support the technology change, drilling more into the culture and the skills piece and getting a bit more granular around that.
We have to remind ourselves that, schools and academic environments are set up to educate you in a particular way, right? And my experience of that, and I've got 4 children and gone through university and various different things, and I've got a daughter that's dyslexic, is that standard academic method was great for some of my children. What was not a great experience for my daughter, who, by the way, then went on to university, then got an honours degree, but she did it in a very different way. And what she realised was, it's just learning, right? Yep, it's just learning. And we tweaked it so that she was able to learn in a way that she could consume information and knowledge and replay that back in a way that worked for her.
I love that. And I like to talk about that a lot because it's an area that I've experienced quite a lot as well around. And I just think it's so important. And there's not one linear path into technology either. How many people I've met who in the tech sector, for example, who are musicians, as one example off the top of my head, there could be so many tech bands. There could be a VMware band, right? Honestly, but there's so many different pathways. And that's something with some of the mentoring and things I do. You don't have to come from a coding background, for example. And again, if you look at the trends there, low code, no code, and kind of that's a complementary strengths anyway. Probably will have a lot more specialists in that area, but overall it's kind of rise of the generalist is really important at the moment, having your specialism, but also this ability to pivot, going back to some earlier things we talked about, and having skills in this broader area, this kind of broad canvas to draw from that gives you that confidence as well, but also helps you be more capable for all the different changes we've been talking about today. I think that combination kind of held you in good stead, should we say, to be agile and pivot to kind of all the ambidexterity we've got at the moment in so many different ways.
Yeah, totally agree.
Fantastic. And talking about what you were saying there about kind of different demographics, or about your family there and your children, one other thing I found really interesting is expectation changes via different demographics. So we mentioned ESG earlier. I'm certainly seeing kind of Gen Z and below really kind of leading the curve in what they're looking for in relationships with organizations, brands, etc. Sustainability being right up there as one example too. But it also affects other things in terms of how you onboard new talent. And obviously that's a bit different at the moment too, with different ways in, etc. And there's so many different considerations here. Have you seen that change too? So either from a VMware perspective or again with the different customers you're working with, but how to get more talent in, that diversity of talent, but what's affecting people making those choices? Because again, the ways of working and the offer for that, I'm seeing that as a factor, but also kind of what an organization stands for and delivers, not just for the main sector, but going beyond that, like we talked about with inclusion, for example, earlier.
So I can't say who, because that wouldn't be kind or fair. But I mean, I know of an incredibly talented lady who was offered a role at an organisation but declined it because she didn't feel that the organisation would be supportive of her and her gender, and that was based upon the fact that she looked at the management team and it was poorly represented with female members of staff. So, that's an actual example. I think organisations have thankfully worked out, and some of this they've worked out, some years ago. But this is a generational thing, right? This is not a fix in a 5-year sprint. This is time and time and time again. And I think, I don't think I know, because when I worked for a very large American organisation, we were very focused on it in all types of diversity and inclusion, and that ranged from making sure that when we turned up to events that we had that full representation of diversity and inclusion, so it would mirror what we were trying to attract into the organisation, that we, in technology particularly, demystified it slightly because it was seen as being a bit of a nerd shop, and you had to go and get a computer science degree and you had to go to a particular university. And as you said earlier, there's an absolute pool of talent out there that can be pulled into these organisations and have very, very successful careers and grow massively within the organisation. I didn't get a degree. I didn't go down the degree route. Right. I went through the apprentice route. Brilliant. So now I'm an absolute advocate for anyone doing apprenticeships, because I can say, well, I don't know if and better's an interesting term, right? Could I have achieved more? I don't think I could, really. So I think I've done quite well. I'm quite happy with my lot and all the rest of it. But I think now what you're starting to see is, and I'm a STEM ambassador as part of what I do here, and I got involved in that because I love talking to people and love talking to the kids and saying, look at me, I was an idiot and look at what I've done, right? So so now, whether that be direct sponsorship into programs, into universities and colleges, whether that be sponsoring apprenticeships, but actually just getting into the local community, getting into schools, demystifying. If I worked in the Wharf for many, many years, and some of the the poorest boroughs in the UK sit around Canary Wharf, and they just look at these glass buildings, right? So get people in the buildings, and it's just a building. Right? How do you get internships? I've got one of the guys that works for me. He came in as an intern. He's now joined full time. Went through the grad program, joined full time. It's now been promoted. More practical experience, and he's absolutely phenomenal talent. So that for me is about all demystifying, and then you've got to make yourself attractive, right? So how flexible are you on those working arrangements? What type of programs can you run? Are you going to offer a return to work capability for people that have had to take time off historically because of children, or to care for people in their family, which is quite common in some of the communities that we operate in, if you're a caregiver, etc. So how do you then encourage people back? And so you can't just say, here's my silver bullet, there you go. You've got to do all of these things, and you can't stop. You can't just say that hasn't worked, because it just hasn't worked now. You just got to keep on creating that capability. That's vibrant for the culture of the organisation. VMware is really, really good. I have to say that, and in my experience with VMware, it's incredibly good. And really leading a lot of the far better than I think some of the other organisations that I've worked for and around. So you have to do it. If you don't, you're not going to have a diversity of workforce. If we don't have a diversity of workforce, you're not going to get the best results, because there's practically, historically, and academically proven that diversity at all levels creates better teams and better outcomes.
Absolutely. And going back to what I said before about kind of expectation and behavioural change as well, people are prepared to take action when they see that not happening. Like the lady you said who didn't see that visibility reflected of what's really happening in society and walked away from that opportunity. We're seeing it again from whether that's a product service point of view or an advocacy point of view or employment, like you were mentioning there as well. We're seeing not just expectations of it being the way we think it should be, but people are prepared to move on that and not buy or not work with, etc., if they're not seeing that happening. So it's a real interesting kind of convergent point there, I think, too. And I love what you said as well about kind of bridging. So Canary Wharf example, there's an organization I know, and they won't mind me saying this, it's Refinitiv, so they're part of their LSE now as well. I know that they came together quite recently, but what they've done in Canada Square in London is they've created a theatre on one of the floors of their head office, and it's kind of a bridge working with some local charities and schools, etc., bringing people in, reusing that space in a different way. So obviously for client facing things as well, but literally a bridge to the community to get a hands-on experience, be part of the organisation, get time in, and they've kind of reinvented space to support that mentoring activity, and have evolved over time as situations have changed as well. So there's so much we can do that can literally bridge that gap and give people that experience, but also make better use and more reflective use of space because of what we've all learnt about how technology can bring us together as well, make the best of both, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I wanted to mention that because it's a great project that they're doing there. It's really good. And I know we're a bit short on time now, so perhaps we could kind of fast forward to where we might be going next. So I know we brought so many, pick a mix of different topics here, but I think it really reflects what's going on in the world at the moment. So many different elements coming together. But if you were going to kind of pick out maybe a gold, silver or bronze of what might be coming next, what people should be looking at in terms of future developments, going back to this sector specifically for financial services. So it could be something from the technology perspective about where this convergence is going next, or any other elements we brought to the fore, because I think they're all equally valuable at the moment. But what would you advise people to look out for, to be thinking about what might be coming next?
So people who've got the ability to make decisions and spend money, the challenge is, where can I spend it best, right? So whether it be a return or the biggest impact. So I think there are a couple of themes, right? And we won't necessarily dwell on any, right? So absolutely, emerging technologies, AI, ML, is happening. It's been around for a long while. Then now the impact is now everyone can dial into ChatGPT and ask it questions and get it to do its homework. So it's here to stay, whether we like it or not. The challenge will be about how do I harness that, or how do these organisations harness that to create better capabilities that are compliant. Because cut code is great, but you can cut code so it's actually got a logical bias in it. So therefore, that's not good, right? So I think those, that the emerging technologies and the guide rails that the regulator puts alongside. I think that you don't need a bank to bank. So this is the challenge for a lot of the established organisations. They don't want necessarily. So if you take a very large bank that's got tens of millions, and there are some that have got tens of millions of customers, they don't necessarily want tens of millions more. What they want is they want to cross-sell 3 products to those tens of millions rather than one product. And when they want to create a capability such that people like me don't just put their money in there from their checking account and then move it out to all of the wonderful fancy apps that exist. They want to retain it, and that's the value. So I think more around the customer experience, the customer capability, the functionality and data, and monetizing that data. And then the one probably sort of dips in and out, and this is a global view, is the regulation. So in Europe, you've got the Digital Operations Resiliency Act, DORA, as it's referred to. There are equally different emerging controls and guidelines coming from Asia Pacific, Japan, and this is going to apply. Some companies will see this as, oh, that's not fair, they're applying the brakes. Other companies will see it as, oh, I'm so grateful they're applying the brakes because that's the only way I've got to navigate a corner if I'm going too fast. And that's about risk appetite. But I think that over the next 2 to 3 years, we are going to see a lot more progressive controls, demand, and need to satisfy regulation than we have done over the past few years. because we loosened it because of COVID, and we went, that was great. But you've now got AI, you've now got this emergence of, the monetization of data. I think regulation is back on the radar.
I agree. I think you have really good points there about the geographical differences as well. Because again, I think AI can have a real role to play there to help take some of the weight off that when compliance needs change. Again, that kind of human machine complementary strengths, if you see what I mean, take away some of that load. I think it's important, particularly as you said as well, with ESG, even more regulation and compliance needs coming in there. Some mandated from the industry and driving it kind of from within, but obviously externally, and again, different government priorities, etc. there too. So really important area. I also think AI explainability with the acceleration we're seeing, and particularly like ChatGPT. I'm seeing so many everywhere. It's everywhere, isn't it? And the demos we're seeing around that, the race, I think you really put that to the fore there about how different perspectives on this will vary so much. So I can see things from different perspectives on this too. But I think the explainability piece alongside it is going to be even more critical than it was already, because we've got the acceleration piece happening right now. Also things around data waste and how we can again turn a negative to more of an opportunity, because the amount that's archived, and when we're seeing what's happening with 5G and again more and more convergence, the volume of this is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But the waste is going higher and higher and higher. What are we archiving? What are we using it for? How can we use this to close some of the skills gaps with training aids, etc., and kind of turn it around? Those are the sort of things I think about and I get involved in.
Well, I read an article recently, and the argument, the hypothesis was that any data that's older than 6 months is of no value. So we're only going to increase the volume of data that we generate, and we already do. I mean, we used to write a check, and there would be 10 pieces of data off the check. Every time I make a payment off my mobile phone, there's probably 100 pieces of data.
Yes. Yeah.
of which 80 I'm not aware are even being captured. So, how is that going to be used? How is that monetized? Is that my data or someone else's data to make money on? How they profiling me? That is all to come. All of those challenges are in the path of progress, one might argue, but actually to satisfy them, you make much faster progress.
Quite agree. And underpinning that too, I think a bigger focus around identity management. I'm seeing some interesting avenues around there as well. Gosh, we could go on this all day really in terms of topic areas, but definitely want to mention that one because I think it's kind of going to be a bit of a new frontier, and I've got something coming up on that quite shortly too. So Brian, I could speak to you so much longer on this. There's so many different things. Carry on. You were about to say something. I saw that.
Well, so the digital identity is the key.
Yeah.
Right? If you think about it, but whose digital identity is it? So if I create one called Brian Hayes, is that my digital identity or is that someone else's? And is that available to everyone and everything? And is that available to the government? Where does it stop? So there's social impact on that. And I'm not smart enough to navigate through that. And the good news is it will probably take 20 years to get it through, Parliament. But those are the questions that are out there.
Exactly. Whose identity is it anyway? I think we should call that as a future piece, Brian. Definitely. I know I have to close this, Brian, but honestly, it's been a real pleasure. I love the fact it's been such a free-flowing conversation, which is what I always like to do, and kind of going off on different areas that really reflect just the multiple different changes that are happening at the moment and the need to look at all these things holistically and not from one standpoint only. It really is this collective. I know what I was going to say, the power of the ecosystem and collaboration. It's the collective. That's the other kind of trend I'm seeing more and more, particularly with some of the bigger challenges around things like ESG is one example of that too. People are really seeing that's how you make change happen faster. So that open, secure data sharing, connectivity, etc., to enable it, of course. But there's much more of a will to come together, I think, than we've ever seen before. So let's harness that as a positive impact from what we've seen over the COVID and beyond.
Yep. Thank you very much indeed. I really, really enjoyed it. It has been a chat. It's been everything it's supposed to be. It's been you've got to get the genie back in the bottle sometimes with me, but hopefully that's fun to listen to for your listeners.
Oh, really appreciate it. Thank you, Brian. I have this expression, purposeful tangents is always the best moments. I always think in a podcast chat. So thank you so much. And thank you all for watching and listening too. We'll be back with a new episode of Tomorrow's Tech Today very soon. Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Tomorrow's Tech Today. If you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe to us and leave a review. It really means a lot. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram and see more behind the scenes video footage on YouTube. Thanks for listening.